writings on bamboo offer accounts of the shaking. Ancient legend has it that snakes offered warnings of doom by creating holes in the ground in advance of a tremor. In other parts of Asia, scholars believed that turtles and fish caused the earth to move. In 580 BC, the Greek writer Thales of Miletus advanced a more scientific theory. He thought the earth floated on a giant ocean and that storms caused the land to shake. More than a century later, Aristotle thought winds were somehow responsible.
Now, there were a lot of volcanoes in Greece and that part of Europe, so they tended to think of fiery winds trapped underground or the combustion of sulfur or something like that as a cause for earthquakes, which is probably a pretty good physical theory, but didn't happen to be right.
The explorer René Descartes in 1623 was on the right track. He blamed earthquakes on subterranean forces, gases that built up beneath the surface. The person who correctly concluded that the composition of the Earth's crust played a role was Robert Hooke. He wrote about it in his Discourse on Earthquakes, published in 1668. This theory was difficult for some to embrace. People of this era believed earthquakes to be acts of God. It was a catastrophic earthquake in Portugal in 1755 that marks the beginning of modern seismology. At 9:30 on the morning of November 1st, violent shaking that lasted for 10 minutes leveled the city of Lisbon. The quake spawned a tremendous tsunami, a sea wave that swamped the coasts of Portugal, Spain, and Morocco. Fueled by the power of the earthquake, the tsunami was driven into the islands of Antigua, Martinique, and Barbados, more than 2,000 miles away. The combined calamities claimed 70,000 lives that Sunday.
Since a lot of people were in church and were killed by the fall of the churches, sort of shook people's faith in a way and opened a way for the Age of Enlightenment.
As a result, scientific investigations into the timing, location, and effects of quakes began. A series of earthquakes in Calabria, Italy in 1783 furthered serious study. A team of academicians from Naples investigated the disasters. They reported on what they believed to be the center of the quakes and changes in the condition of the ground. Still, the exact nature of earthquakes remained a mystery for another century. Then in the late 1800s, one scientist's efforts unraveled clues about the planet's core. He was Englishman John Milne. He created the field of study known as earth science.
He was a university professor in Japan in the 1880s and 1890s, a time when Japan had brought in scholars from outside the country to help them rapidly catch up with the West now that Japan had been opened. And there were many earthquakes in Japan, some of them serious, and he was among a group of scholarly men that felt that it was time to apply the methods of scientific study to earthquakes.
Milne and his colleagues designed and built the world's first dependable seismograph, a device for mechanically measuring and recording the waves produced by earthquakes. It worked with a weight attached to a wire or spring. The weight was suspended, allowing it to remain still when the earth moved. A pen attached to the weight recorded the movements on a sheet of paper that was wound around a rotating drum. The wavy lines were the result of shaking. Straight lines meant the earth was still.
Milne and his group had designed something that they could keep running because you never know when an earthquake is going to happen. You don't have time to prepare your instrument.
This technological breakthrough proved its value barely 40 years later, when the great Kanto earthquake decimated Japan on September 1st, 1923. Seismographs recorded continuous ground motions for 4 days, giving scientists a clear seismologic picture of what happened, in addition to the physical destruction that was evident for many square miles. Milne made a second invaluable contribution to earthquake research. He created a network of seismographs throughout Japan and eventually in other earthquake-prone countries.
One seismic station doesn't do you any good. To do seismology, you need to share it from different sites. So 100 years ago, there was a network of seismologists mailing seismograms around the world.
Integral to this network were the Jesuits, whose technical knowledge and expertise was second to none, based on a centuries-old tradition of scholarship in various scientific fields.
They had monasteries around the world, and of course were scientists themselves, and they ended up setting up seismometers in each of their monasteries. And the old records, the Jesuit records, are the best source that we have for some of these old earthquakes at various places around the world.
These turn-of-the-century innovations advanced the science of the day to its fullest potential. Even today, tracking seismic waves through a network of equipment is the backbone of earthquake technology and research, though much more sophisticated.
This will detect any earthquakes around the world, local, wherever. It records all the different waveforms that are generated in an earthquake.
This humble-looking sensor is state-of-the-art. Thousands of these and similar devices are buried several feet beneath the ground all over the world. They electronically measure the Earth's movements.
Imagine that you're staring down into a puddle, and you have a bunch of sensors in the puddle, distributed throughout the puddle. And you drop a stone in the middle, and you can watch the waves spread away from that where you've dropped the pebble. And it hits these sensors at different times. That's equivalent to what an earthquake is. The earthquake generates sound waves, and we have our seismic sensors, and the waves get to them at different times.
The basic thing that allowed us to do all of this is the computer. As the amount of capabilities for processing data increased.
Today's computers synthesize enormous quantities of complex data from sensors and store the information as well.
It's the revolutionary age that came out of the space program is what really has driven our capabilities to increase our capability to monitor and to record earthquakes.
Before computers, we would take the seismogram off the drums every morning, and people would sit down with a ruler and read off the arrival time of the waves and write it on 4x8 cards.
These manual calculations, which continued into the 1980s, were time-consuming and limiting. As a result, technology has rendered this familiar sight a relic. The seismograph's only function today is as a media tool, illustrating that an earthquake has occurred. All the technological advances in the world cannot prevent earthquakes, but they have led to improvements in construction engineering that are designed to save lives.
The torment of a nation, Chile, its southern half devastated.
In May of 1960, an earthquake like no other jolted the South American country of Chile, cutting a swath of destruction nearly the length of the entire nation.
Thousands are dead, 1/4 of the nation, over 2 million homeless, and still the upheavals continue. Whole cities have been
It was the largest earthquake ever recorded, a magnitude 9.5. Here's the actual seismogram of the shaking that was documented 5,500 miles away at a monitoring station in Pasadena, California that day. 4 years later, in March of 1964, an earthquake rocked Alaska. Enormous sections of the earth were lifted and then dropped by a quake under the ocean. At magnitude 9.2, it was the worst in North American history. And in Tangshan, China in 1976, a killer earthquake, magnitude 8, left at least 250,000 people dead. It wiped almost 20 square miles near the capital of Beijing off the map. Numbers assigned to an earthquake indicate its intensity or strength. There are several different scales of measure. One reflects the energy released, another its effects on buildings. A magnitude 5, 6, or higher can indicate significant structural damage.
The shaking won't kill you. If you're outside and you're subjected to 45 seconds of strong shaking, you might fall down. If you're in a building that collapses, I think everybody knows the consequences. And that's what we're really trying to do now, is to focus on mitigation.
That means protecting buildings and people from the power of earthquakes. It has so far proved to be an engineering challenge, one that hasn't yet been mastered, as experts readily acknowledge.
Well, of course, earthquake-proof is a rather arrogant term for a human being to use.
Designing better and safer structures is a science all its own. There are several theories behind current engineering technology.
Tall buildings are designed to be very flexible. When you move the base of a tall building, it sends waves up the building, and the forces associated with sending those waves are much less. So making a building flexible means you don't need to make it as strong.
But built-in flexibility has drawbacks, as recent history has shown.
One of the most famous examples of technology catastrophe was in the 1980s.